London, 1888. The night air is wet, thick with the smell of coal smoke and sewage, a city choking on its own hunger. Whitechapel is not a place for the faint of heart. It is a place of shadows, of narrow alleys slick with rain and desperation, where the gas lamps barely hold back the dark. It is here, in this crowded corner of the East End, that a whisper begins to crawl through the streets, a whisper that will soon become a scream. The first body is found in the early hours of the morning. A woman lying in the gutter with her throat cut so deeply that it seems her head might roll free. The police arrive, but there is little they can do except cover the corpse and send her name to the press. Mary Ann Nichols, a prostitute, another dead woman in Whitechapel. But this killing is different. The cut is surgical, deliberate, the work of a man who understands flesh. Before the shock of Nichols' murder can settle, another woman is found, this time in Hanbury Street. Her body opened with a precision that leaves the most hardened detectives sickened. Annie Chapman. 2 murders, same method, same quarter of the city. London is beginning to panic. The newspapers seize on the horror, selling lurid headlines by the thousands. The killer is named by the press, Jack the Ripper, and with that name, a legend is born. Each night, women walk the streets with their heads down, scanning the dark corners for a man who might step out of the fog with a blade. Each morning, the city waits for news of another murder. The police are stretched thin, stumbling through the filth of Whitechapel with no leads, no witnesses, nothing but mutilated bodies left behind as if mocking them. For the killer does not rush. He kills when he chooses, where he chooses, and vanishes like smoke before anyone can catch him. By the time the third victim is found, London knows that this is not random. This is a pattern. This is a hunter, and he is not finished. The fear becomes a living thing, pressing against every locked door, coiling in every alley. Somewhere out there, a man walks among them, blending into the crowd, smiling as he sharpens his knife for the next kill. The morning of September 30th, 1888, begins like any other, but by dawn, London is holding its breath. 2 women are found dead within an hour of each other, and suddenly the fear that has gripped Whitechapel boils over into hysteria. The first victim, Elizabeth Stride, is discovered in a dark yard off Berner Street, her throat cut but her body otherwise untouched. Some whisper that the killer was interrupted, frightened off before he could finish his work. If so, his rage must have been terrible, because less than an hour later, another woman, Catherine Edos, is found in Mitre Square, and this time the scene is even more savage than before. Her throat is slashed, her abdomen cut open, her face mutilated in ways that seem almost ritualistic. The killer has grown bolder, quicker, deadlier, slipping from one murder scene to the next with an ease that defies belief. The newspapers call it the double event, and the city trembles. Crowds gather in the streets, demanding answers, demanding protection, demanding that someone, anyone, stop this phantom butcher before he kills again. Letters begin arriving at police stations and newspapers, some crude jokes, others written in a mocking, taunting tone, claiming responsibility for the murders. One of them, signed Jack the Ripper, is splashed across the front page of nearly every paper in London. The killer has given himself a voice, and now he speaks directly to the city he is terrorizing. Scotland Yard is desperate, sending detectives into the labyrinth of Whitechapel, interviewing anyone who might have seen something. But no one has seen anything that leads to a face, a name, an arrest. Every man in Whitechapel becomes a suspect. Strangers are stared at in the street. Neighbors whisper about one another. Mobs threaten to beat suspected men to death. The city teeters on the edge of chaos. And somewhere, Jack watches it all with cold amusement. He is ahead of them, cleverer, hungrier, and with every body he leaves behind. He seems to be telling them that this is only the beginning. The night now belongs to him, and London, for all its size and power, is helpless against one man and his knife. By November, the city is suffocating under dread. The pubs in Whitechapel are filled with silent drinkers staring into their glasses, too frightened to walk home alone. Patrols are doubled, detectives swarm the alleys, and yet Jack still slips through the cracks like water through clenched fists. It is in the early hours of November 9th, 1888, that the horror reaches its peak. Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest and most striking of the victims, is found inside her tiny rented room at Miller's Court. This time there is no alleyway, no chance encounter. The killer has lured her indoors, and here he has all the time he wants. What is discovered in that room will haunt even the most hardened officers for the rest of their lives. Kelly's body is barely recognizable as human. Her throat is cut down to the spine, her face flayed, her abdomen emptied of its organs, which are carefully arranged around the bed as though part of some obscene ritual. The very walls seem painted with her blood. The detectives who step inside stagger back out, some of them retching in the street, their boots tracking crimson into the daylight. The murder of Mary Jane Kelly is unlike the others, not just in its savagery, but in its intimacy. It is as if Jack wanted to leave the world a masterpiece of terror, a final signature carved into flesh and plaster. The newspapers go mad with the story, publishing every gruesome detail, and the people of London are nearly driven to riot. Yet, just as suddenly as he appeared, Jack vanishes. There are no more bodies, no more letters, no more sightings. The panic gradually gives way to frustration, then to bitter resignation. Scotland Yard has failed to catch the most infamous killer in history, and he has melted back into the city, perhaps to die. Perhaps to live out his days smiling at the memory of what he did. The case will remain open, unsolved, a gaping wound in London's history. But the legend will not die. Jack the Ripper becomes more than a man. He becomes a myth, a symbol of the darkness that lurks just beyond the lamplight. A reminder that some monsters are never caught, and for Whitechapel, the echoes of those nights will never truly fade. The days after Mary Jane Kelly's murder are filled with hysteria. Scotland Yard calls in some of the finest detectives in Britain, including Frederick Aberline, a man known for his sharp mind and tireless work ethic. They interview hundreds of witnesses, arrest dozens of suspects, and follow every whisper that filters through the East End. But each lead turns to dust. The prime suspects range from butchers to doctors, foreigners to aristocrats. Even members of the royal family are whispered about in smoky back rooms. Theories multiply like rats in the alleys. Perhaps Jack is a surgeon, given his anatomical skill. Perhaps a slaughterhouse worker, comfortable with blood. Perhaps a policeman himself, slipping through the patrol lines with a false sense of authority. Each new name brings a rush of hope, followed by the crushing realization that there is no proof, no confession, no face to match the shadow. The public begins to turn on the police, accusing them of incompetence, or worse, of protecting the killer. Vigilante groups form, patrolling the streets with clubs, but they too find nothing. Then there are the letters. Hundreds of them arrive at police stations and newspapers, some crude jokes, others elaborate taunts. Most are hoaxes, but a few feel different, colder, as though written by someone who has seen the murders up close. The most chilling are signed Jack the Ripper, a name that will become immortal. The letters are filled with mockery, delight, and promises of more blood. Whether all of them come from the killer or from imitators will never be known. But they keep London on edge, wondering when the next strike will come. And then, nothing. Weeks pass, then months, then years. Jack seems to have dissolved into the night, leaving only fear behind. People begin to speculate that he has been imprisoned for another crime, committed suicide, fled to another country, or simply stopped killing. The East End never fully recovers from those nights. Women walk in pairs, glancing behind them. Children are kept inside after dark, and the newspapers never stop printing theories. What Jack began is more powerful than any single murder spree. He has birthed the age of the modern serial killer. The first murderer whose deeds are replayed in the press like theatre, whose name becomes a brand of terror. The hunt for him is not over. It will never be over. The legacy of Jack the Ripper reaches far beyond the fog-shrouded streets of Whitechapel. In many ways, he changed the way the world thought about crime. For the first time, police were forced to confront the concept of a killer who murdered not for profit, passion, or revenge, but seemingly for pleasure. His crimes pushed Scotland Yard to adopt more systematic investigative methods, preserving crime scenes, photographing bodies, and creating one of the earliest criminal profiles. Dr. Thomas Bond, a police surgeon, analyzed the wounds and suggested the killer was a solitary man, likely with anatomical knowledge, living alone, and suffering from a form of homicidal mania. This was revolutionary. The first time psychological profiling had been used in a criminal case. The press, too, learned the power of crime reporting. Newspapers sold out whenever they printed new details of the murders, and some even exaggerated facts or invented clues to keep the public hungry for more. Crime had become entertainment, and Jack the Ripper was its first global celebrity. His image, shadowed, faceless, top-hatted, became shorthand for the lurking killer in the night. For the people of London, however, the fear was real and enduring. Whitechapel's reputation sank even lower, branded forever as the hunting ground of a phantom butcher. Women in the East End faced renewed stigma, blamed by moralists who said they invited death by walking the streets. Meanwhile, conspiracy theories bloomed, some suggesting cover-ups at the highest levels of government. Over time, the mystery took on a life of its own, inviting endless speculation. Writers like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle weighed in with theories, while amateur sleuths began their own investigations. More than a century later, Jack remains a subject of fascination for criminologists, historians, and true crime enthusiasts. Every decade brings a new suspect, a new book claiming to have solved the mystery, but the truth stays just out of reach. And maybe that is why Jack the Ripper endures, because he was never caught, because he left behind not just corpses, but questions that can never be fully answered. He turned murder into myth and fear into something that could outlive him. Whitechapel still draws tourists who walk the narrow alleys, standing where the victims fell, wondering if the man who killed them still walks among us in some form, if not in flesh. Then in the darkness we carry in our own imaginations. The question of who Jack the Ripper was has haunted investigators for over a century, and with every passing decade, the suspect list grows longer. The most infamous of these suspects is Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher whose suicide in December 1888 came just weeks after Mary Jane Kelly's murder. Police at the time quietly suggested Druitt's death ended the killings, and some later investigators believed he fit the psychological profile, an educated man whose mind unraveled until he took his own life. But there was no hard evidence linking him to the crimes. Another enduring suspect is Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-born barber living in Whitechapel, whose history of mental illness and hatred of women made him suspicious to police. Scotland Yard named him as a prime suspect years later, and in 2014, claims emerged that DNA from a shawl found at one of the murder scenes matched Kosminski's descendants. Critics, however, argue the testing was flawed and the shawl's provenance uncertain, leaving the case unproven. Then there is George Chapman, born Severin Koloskis, a barber surgeon who later poisoned 3 of his wives and was executed for the murders. Inspector Aberline himself suspected Chapman of being Jack, pointing to his anatomical skills and proximity to the crimes. But Chapman's murders were methodical poisonings, not frenzied mutilations, leading many to doubt he was capable of such savage butchery. The list does not end there. There are artists, princes, sailors, doctors, even women accused of being Jack. Some theories veer into the conspiratorial, suggesting the murders were part of a cover-up involving the royal family and a secret child of Prince Albert Victor. Others argue Jack was never one man, but several killers acting independently, their crimes mistakenly tied together. What is certain is that no suspect has ever been proven beyond doubt, and perhaps that is the Ripper's final victory. He is not one man, but every man, an idea that can wear 1,000 faces. To name him conclusively might rob the story of its chilling power, the knowledge that the perfect killer could walk among us unseen. Each theory brings us closer, but like the fog in Whitechapel, the truth seems to slip through our fingers the moment we reach for it. The cultural impact of the Ripper murders cannot be overstated. Jack the Ripper did more than terrorize London. He created a blueprint for the way we consume crime. The Victorian press turned the murders into a serialized drama, releasing gruesome details in installments that kept the public hungry for more. Crowds gathered at newsstands, waiting for the next headline, as if it were the latest chapter in a novel. This was crime, a spectacle, and it changed journalism forever. Sensational reporting became the norm, birthing the tabloid style that thrives to this day. Writers and artists were quick to capitalize on the fascination. Penny dreadfuls, cheap, lurid booklets, retold the murders in grotesque detail. The Ripper became the archetype of the mysterious killer in dark alleys, inspiring generations of fictional murderers. Even the character of Sherlock Holmes, who debuted during this period, owes something to Jack. He became the detective the public wished they had during the Ripper panic. Brilliant, logical, always one step ahead of evil. The case also left its mark on theatre and later cinema. From early stage plays to Alfred Hitchcock's silent masterpiece, The Lodger, to countless modern horror films, the Ripper has become a symbol of lurking, anonymous danger. In literature, he haunts the pages of crime novels and historical fiction, sometimes as a shadowy figure, sometimes fully imagined as a character with motives and inner thoughts. Beyond art, Jack the Ripper shaped the public's relationship with fear. His murders taught society that the killer could be anyone, not a monstrous stranger, but perhaps the quiet man who lives next door, the butcher you buy meat from, the doctor who treats you. That realization sparked a collective paranoia that never truly left urban life. Today, walking tours of Whitechapel lead visitors down the same narrow streets where the victims once walked, turning the crime scenes into a grim tourist attraction. Museums display Ripper letters and artifacts, and documentaries revisit the case every few years with new theories. Jack became the first true crime celebrity, and in a way, we have kept him alive by never letting his story die. He is as much a product of society's fascination with evil as he is a product of the East End's darkness. The case opened a door, and once opened, the public's appetite for true crime has never been satisfied. The psychological and social aftermath of the Ripper murders was profound, reshaping London's relationship with its own underclass. For the women of Whitechapel, the killings were both a tragedy and a brutal reminder of how expendable society considered them. Many of the victims were sex workers, living hand-to-mouth in squalid lodging houses, often turning to prostitution simply to afford a bed for the night. Their murders forced Victorian society to confront the reality of life in the East End: overcrowded slums, rampant disease, alcoholism, and unemployment. But instead of compassion, much of the public reacted with moral judgment, blaming the victims for their fate. Respectable society used the murders as a cautionary tale about vice, claiming the women brought death upon themselves by living immoral lives. Yet, paradoxically, the killings also spurred early discussions about social reform. Philanthropists, clergymen, and even some politicians began calling for better housing, work opportunities, and protections for vulnerable women. The police force, humiliated by their failure to catch the killer, underwent gradual reform as well. The Ripper case highlighted the limitations of Victorian policing: no fingerprinting system, no centralized criminal database, and no standardized investigative procedures. In the years that followed, Scotland Yard adopted new forensic practices, including preserving physical evidence more carefully and improving communication between divisions. The idea of criminal profiling, pioneered during the Ripper case, slowly gained traction, laying the groundwork for the behavioral science units that would emerge a century later. For London itself, the murders were a stain that could not be washed away. Whitechapel became synonymous with danger, poverty, and crime, and middle and upper-class Londoners developed a grim fascination with the area. Some would even tour the crime scenes, a macabre form of slumming that turned the East End's suffering into a grotesque attraction. This voyeuristic tendency would persist, with each new anniversary of the murders sparking books, films, and television specials that revisit the terror. Perhaps most haunting of all was the way fear lingered long after the killings stopped. Women continued to glance over their shoulders at night, and parents used the name Jack to frighten misbehaving children into obedience. The Ripper had become more than a man. He was a story told in whispers, a shadow that stretched across generations, a reminder that the streets were never truly safe once darkness fell. By early 1889, the trail had gone cold. No new murders matched the Ripper's signature, and Scotland Yard's detectives were running out of leads. The press, once frenzied with daily updates, began shifting its attention to other scandals. The East End returned to its usual struggles with poverty and crime, but a strange silence lingered. For the investigators, the unsolved case was an open wound. Inspector Aberline, who had given years of his life to chasing the phantom killer, eventually admitted defeat. Files were closed, witnesses moved on, and suspects faded into obscurity. The Ripper investigation would be reopened several times over the following decades as new evidence or theories surfaced, but each time the outcome was the same: no conclusive proof, no arrest, no confession. The inability to catch Jack became a national embarrassment for Victorian policing, a symbol of failure that haunted Scotland Yard for generations. Yet, This failure may have been what cemented Jack the Ripper's immortality. Because he was never caught, he remained a blank canvas onto which every generation could project its own fears. Amateur detectives and historians kept the case alive, poring over dusty police reports, crime scene sketches, and newspaper clippings, convinced they could succeed where the original detectives had failed. Some even claimed to have solved the mystery, naming everyone from obscure butchers to prominent royals as the killer, but the debate has never been settled. Over time, the Ripper case became less about justice and more about legend. Whitechapel itself leaned into the notoriety, and by the turn of the 20th century, walking tours were already being organized to guide the curious through the murder sites. The killer had become a ghost story London could not stop telling. This enduring mystery created a new genre of fascination, the unsolved serial killer case, which still dominates books, films, and podcasts today. Each time another generation discovers Jack, they are drawn not only to the blood and horror, but to the chilling absence of resolution. There is something uniquely terrifying about a murderer who simply disappears, leaving no closure for his victims or for society. In the end, Jack the Ripper's greatest crime may not have been the murders themselves, but the way he vanished, leaving behind a riddle that no one can solve, a puzzle that keeps the world staring into the fog, hoping to glimpse a face that will never be revealed. Modern investigators have not been able to resist the lure of Jack the Ripper's mystery. And in the past few decades, technology has been turned on the century-old case in an attempt to finally unmask him. Handwriting experts have re-examined the infamous letters, comparing them to known samples from various suspects, though results remain inconclusive. Some letters may be genuine, others clever forgeries meant to stir panic, but which are which is still debated. Crime scene photos and coroner reports have been digitally enhanced to study wound patterns in greater detail, leading to new theories about the killer's skill level. Some modern profilers argue Jack may not have been a trained surgeon at all, but simply someone comfortable with blood and violence, such as a butcher or slaughterhouse worker. The most dramatic development came with DNA testing. In 2014, researchers claimed they had identified Aaron Kosminski as the killer after testing mitochondrial DNA from a shawl allegedly found near Catherine Edo's body. The announcement made global headlines, but critics quickly challenged the findings. The chain of custody for the shawl was never secure. It passed through private collectors for over a century, and mitochondrial DNA cannot uniquely identify one person, only their maternal line. The debate left the case as unsettled as ever. Other theories have gained traction in recent years, pointing to lesser-known suspects or even suggesting the murders were not all committed by the same hand. Some criminologists argue that at least one of the canonical five may have been killed by a different person entirely, meaning the legend of Jack may be partly a creation of the press, stitching separate crimes together into a single narrative. The inability of modern science to solve the case adds to its mystique. In an age where cold cases are routinely cracked by genetic genealogy and forensic breakthroughs, the Ripper case stands as a reminder of the limits of technology when the evidence is too degraded or incomplete. Each attempt to close the file seems to breathe new life into the mystery, sparking fresh books, documentaries, and debates. The hunt continues not because justice is still possible, but because we are drawn to the chase itself, to the dream that one day we might finally rip away the mask and stare into the face of the man who turned Whitechapel into a nightmare. Jack the Ripper's story ends not with justice but with transformation. He becomes something more enduring than any single man. His killings were a horror for Victorian London, but they were also the beginning of a cultural obsession that still grips us today. Jack is the prototype for the modern serial killer narrative, a faceless figure who strikes without warning, leaves behind clues, taunts investigators, and then vanishes into the night. Before him, murder was often personal, a crime of passion or revenge, but Jack showed the world that a killer could operate like a phantom, targeting strangers, feeding off the fear of an entire city. He gave birth to the idea of the unknown predator, a terror that seeps into literature, theater, film, and eventually the news cycle. Every true crime series, every late-night documentary, every chilling podcast owes a debt to Jack. He turned crime into a mystery for the masses, one that invited endless speculation and amateur detective work. His legend blurred the line between reality and myth until he became a kind of dark folk hero, the man no one could catch, the riddle no one could solve. That is why we still walk the streets of Whitechapel today, following his ghost. The cobblestones have changed, the gaslights have been replaced by neon, but the story still hangs in the air like fog. Guides point to the spots where the women were killed, and tourists feel a chill knowing that the ground they stand on once ran red with blood. The case endures because it touches something primal, our fear of the predator, who is cleverer than the hunters, who slips through every net and proves that safety is an illusion. Jack the Ripper is not just a murderer. He is a mirror, reflecting our fascination with death and the darkness we cannot name. He began as a killer of women in London's poorest quarter, but he became a symbol of every unsolved crime, every face that was never brought to light. In the end, Jack is both nowhere and everywhere, a shadow that still follows us more than a century later, reminding us that there are questions we may never answer and monsters we may never catch. Chicago, 1893. The city is alive with anticipation, preparing for the grand spectacle of the world's Columbian Exposition, a world's fair meant to showcase progress, industry, and the future of America. But hidden in the shadows of that celebration is a man who will turn that dream into a nightmare. His name is Herman Webster Mudgett, though history will remember him by the name he chose for himself, Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. On the surface, Holmes is everything Victorian society admires: charming, educated, impeccably dressed, and with a soft, persuasive voice that can disarm even the most cautious stranger. Beneath that polished exterior, however, is something else entirely. A predator who sees other human beings not as lives, but as opportunities. Holmes arrives in Chicago years before the fair and purchases a plot of land in Englewood, where he begins construction on a building that will later earn the nickname the Murder Castle to outsiders. It appears to be a large, busy hotel designed to accommodate the influx of visitors expected for the fair. Inside, though, Holmes designs a labyrinth of horrors: windowless rooms, hidden staircases, soundproof chambers, doors that lock only from the outside, and a basement equipped with vats of acid, lime pits, and a custom-built furnace that can cremate bodies. He hires and fires multiple construction crews to ensure no one knows the full layout of the building, keeping the blueprints and his true intentions secret. By the time the fair opens, Holmes is ready. He lures young women, often those new to the city and looking for work, with promises of employment or lodging. Many never leave the building alive. Holmes uses his skills as a pharmacist and his understanding of anatomy to carry out killings with chilling precision, sometimes gassing his victims in sealed rooms, sometimes strangling or poisoning them. Their bodies are disposed of in ways designed to erase their existence, burned, dissolved, or even sold as skeletons to medical schools. The fair, meant to celebrate modernity, becomes Holmes' hunting ground, providing him with a steady stream of prey. And all the while, he maintains the facade of a successful businessman and respectable doctor, charming investors, seducing women, and staying one step ahead of suspicion. Chicago is dazzled by its own progress, unaware that one of the most prolific killers in American history is operating right under its nose. To understand how H. Holmes became America's first notorious serial killer, we must go back to his beginnings. Born Herman Webster Mudgett in 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, he was a bright but peculiar child. Neighbors recalled him as highly intelligent, even precocious, but also secretive and prone to strange behavior. Holmes himself would later claim that his fascination with death began early. One story, perhaps apocryphal, tells of how local bullies forced him to confront a human skeleton. Hoping to scare him instead, he became fascinated by it, staring at the bones until fear turned into curiosity. This macabre moment would foreshadow the rest of his life. Holmes excelled academically, studying medicine at the University of Michigan, where he gained valuable knowledge of human anatomy and dissection. During this time, rumors circulated that Holmes was involved in stealing cadavers from the university lab, using them for insurance fraud by faking accidental deaths. Whether these claims were true or not, they reveal a man already comfortable with deception, death, and profiting from both. After medical school, Holmes reinvented himself repeatedly, moving from town to town under various aliases, scamming businesses, seducing women, and leaving behind a trail of fraud accusations. He had an uncanny ability to manipulate those around him, landlords, creditors, lovers, always escaping just as trouble was about to catch him. By the time he arrived in Chicago in the late 1880s, he had perfected the art of appearing respectable while living a double life. Chicago, a city booming with opportunity and anonymity, was the perfect place for Holmes to thrive. There he set up a pharmacy and began amassing wealth through schemes ranging from fake insurance claims to selling stolen goods. But Holmes was not merely a con artist. Something darker was forming inside him, an appetite that could not be satisfied with money alone. He began taking an interest in vulnerable women, especially those who were isolated or new to the city, women who could disappear without immediate notice. His charm made him irresistible, and his position as a doctor made him trustworthy. One by one, they stepped willingly into his life, unaware they were stepping into the orbit of a predator who saw them not as companions, but as specimens for his own twisted experiments. By the early 1890s, Holmes' building in Englewood stood complete, a 3-block-long structure with shops on the ground floor and what appeared to be rooms for rent above. But behind its innocent brick facade was a maze designed with deadly precision. The second floor held dozens of small rooms, each with a peculiar purpose. Some were airtight and fitted with hidden gas lines. Others had strange chutes that led directly to the basement. There were trapdoors, secret passages, and stairways that ended abruptly at bricked walls. It was a place designed not for comfort but for control, a machine built to trap, kill, and dispose of human beings. Holmes' charm and good looks kept suspicion at bay. Young women drawn to Chicago for the World's Fair often passed through his doors looking for work or lodging, and Holmes seemed like a savior, a respectable doctor offering them a chance to be part of the grand event. Many of these women were never seen again. The disappearances were quiet at first, A stenographer who worked for Holmes left suddenly, supposedly to visit family, though no family ever confirmed it. A young woman who had been engaged to Holmes vanished after an argument, her trunk later found in the building. Some employees who had demanded overdue pay simply moved away, according to Holmes' explanations, though their families never heard from them again. The sheer number of transient workers and travelers in Chicago meant these vanishings didn't raise alarms immediately. Holmes had calculated this perfectly. The fair brought hundreds of thousands of strangers to the city, and a missing person was easily lost in the noise. Holmes' methods were as coldly efficient as the building he had constructed. Some victims were locked in gas chambers and asphyxiated while Holmes watched through peep. Others were tricked into sealed rooms where he left them to die slowly, listening to their pleas from the hallway. The basement was the final stage of his operation. There he stripped the bodies, dissected them, and disposed of them in acid baths, or burned them in the massive furnace. What could not be destroyed was sold to medical schools as clean, articulated skeletons, turning death into profit. To Holmes, the murder castle was not a crime scene but a business enterprise, one where human life was simply another commodity to be consumed. Holmes' ability to lure victims wasn't just a matter of circumstance. It was a refined art of seduction and control. He was not merely a killer. He was a conman who used romance as both bait and camouflage. Holmes married multiple women, often under false names, and sometimes while still legally married to others. To the outside world, he seemed attentive and caring, a perfect gentleman who offered security and opportunity. To the women who trusted him, he became the center of their lives until they outlived their usefulness. One of Holmes' most well-documented entanglements was with Julia Smythe, the wife of a man who worked for him in the drugstore. When Julia's marriage crumbled, she and her daughter moved into the castle, where Holmes promised them a future together. But on Christmas Eve of 1891, Julia and her daughter disappeared. Holmes later claimed she had died during a botched abortion, an excuse investigators would later find suspicious, as Julia was not the last woman to vanish under similar circumstances. Holmes had an uncanny ability to present each disappearance as ordinary. He wrote fake letters to relatives, telling them their loved ones had eloped or taken a job elsewhere. He kept trunks, clothing, and personal effects of his victims locked away, sometimes using them as collateral to scam creditors. Even his wives, those he did not kill, were often kept in ignorance of one another, compartmentalized like the rooms in his murder castle. These relationships also helped fund his empire of deceit. Holmes was constantly in debt, juggling creditors, forging signatures, and setting fires for insurance payouts. The women who fell for him often came with dowries, life insurance policies, or access to family money. When their resources ran out, so did Holmes' interest in keeping them alive. What made Holmes uniquely dangerous was his ability to maintain a calm, respectable public persona while living as a predator. Neighbors saw him as an ambitious young businessman. Police had no reason to suspect him, and his victims often walked willingly into his lair, never realizing they were stepping into a trap designed with mathematical precision. It was this duality, the mask of charm concealing the mind of a killer, that made Holmes more than just a murderer. He was, in many ways, the prototype for the modern serial killer, blending intellect, charisma, and brutality into a single, horrifying figure. The arrival of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition marked the peak of Holmes' deadly enterprise. Chicago was flooded with visitors from around the world, all eager to witness the dazzling spectacle of the White City. Holmes saw more than just a fare. He saw an endless supply of potential victims. Travelers who would not be missed quickly, women seeking work far from home, and tourists with no fixed connections in the city. He advertised rooms for rent at his castle, specifically targeting young women arriving for the fair. His charisma made him the perfect host, welcoming guests with his warm smile, offering employment as typists, stenographers, or shop assistants, and promising them a chance to be part of something historic. Once inside, the trap closed. Witness accounts later suggested that women would check into Holmes' building and then simply vanish. Employees came and went, leaving no forwarding addresses, their possessions quietly appropriated by Holmes. Deliverymen reported seeing trunks and boxes being hauled into the basement and never coming back out. Some of Holmes' associates would later admit they grew suspicious, but his reputation as a doctor and businessman made them doubt their instincts. The fair allowed Holmes to operate with near-total impunity. Chicago's police were overwhelmed with the influx of visitors, thefts, accidents, and other crimes. A missing person could easily be dismissed as someone who had moved on, gone home, or even met with an accident somewhere else in the sprawling city. Holmes exploited this chaos to the fullest. He began experimenting with more elaborate methods of murder, testing the airtight rooms and gas jets he had installed, refining his process of body disposal to leave as little evidence as possible. In one chilling account, he was said to have stood behind a concealed panel, watching his victims suffocate, as though conducting a scientific experiment. The furnace in the basement glowed night after night, burning away the last traces of the dead. The fair that was meant to celebrate human achievement became, for Holmes, a hunting ground, a place where he could kill without consequence, fueled by the anonymity of the crowd. The city that stood for progress and modernity unknowingly sheltered one of the most prolific murderers in American history, operating just a few miles from its shining white exhibition halls. By the end of the World's Fair, Holmes' web of lies was beginning to fray. His scams had grown bolder, and the number of creditors he owed was multiplying. He had taken out insurance policies on people who would later vanish, borrowed money using collateral that didn't exist, and forged signatures with increasing recklessness. His charm, which had shielded him for so long, was starting to wear thin as suspicious business partners began to press him for answers. Several of Holmes' accomplices, people he had hired to help construct the murder castle, had started to talk, claiming they were never paid and hinting at strange things they had seen in the building. Windowless rooms, odd smells coming from the basement, and deliveries of large quantities of chemicals like quicklime and acid. Holmes kept moving, constantly changing names and locations to stay ahead of both creditors and suspicions. He left Chicago frequently, traveling to other cities where he committed new frauds and, it is believed, new murders. He married Georgiana Yoke under yet another alias, continuing his habit of maintaining multiple marriages simultaneously, and brought her along on his travels. Even during these trips, he seemed unable to resist killing. One of his most notorious crimes outside Chicago was the murder of Benjamin Petersil, a man who had been his business associate and accomplice in insurance fraud schemes. Holmes had convinced Petersil to fake his own death so they could collect on a $10,000 life insurance policy. But instead of using a cadaver as planned, Holmes murdered Petersil himself, knocking him unconscious and setting him on fire. By the end of the World's Fair, Holmes' luck began to shift. The same ambition that drove him to kill also drove him to keep expanding his schemes, and with expansion came mistakes. His web of fraud grew so tangled that creditors, insurers, and former business partners began to circle. Holmes was constantly moving money, forging documents, and creating new scams to stay ahead of the law. He took out life insurance policies on associates and lovers, naming himself as the beneficiary, a plan that worked only if those associates conveniently disappeared. Some of these disappearances were so frequent and so suspicious that people around Holmes began to whisper. He had partners who assisted him with building construction, property dealings, and scams. But many of them met mysterious fates or vanished before they could testify against him. Holmes' increasingly brazen behavior also started attracting the attention of Pinkerton detectives and police departments in several states. One of the first major cracks in his facade came through a man named Benjamin Pitezel, a carpenter who would become Holmes' closest criminal partner. Together, they engaged in various schemes, including insurance fraud. Holmes convinced Pitezel to take out a $10,000 life insurance policy, assuring him they would fake his death and split the payout. But when the time came, Holmes decided that faking a death was too risky when he could create a real one. In September 1894, Pitezel's charred body was discovered in a Philadelphia building that had been deliberately set on fire. At first, investigators believed Holmes' story that Pitezel had accidentally killed himself in an explosion, but inconsistencies in Holmes' testimony drew suspicion. The insurance company, skeptical of the claim, hired the Pinkertons to track Holmes down. Meanwhile, Holmes had taken custody of 3 of Pitezel's children under the guise of caring for them while their father was hiding. He'd moved the children across multiple cities, keeping them isolated from each other and from their mother. This decision would later become one of his most chilling and damning crimes. With creditors closing in, the Pinkertons on his trail, and bodies piling up, Holmes' carefully crafted mask of respectability began to slip. For the first time, it seemed that the doctor who thought himself untouchable was finally within reach of the law, setting the stage for one of the most shocking revelations in American true crime history. Holmes' downfall came swiftly once the Pinkertons committed to pursuing him. He was arrested in Boston in November 1894 for insurance fraud. But what began as a simple case of swindling soon unraveled into something much darker. Investigators quickly realized that Holmes' crimes stretched across multiple states, involving suspicious deaths, vanished women, and forged documents. As detectives dug deeper, they turned their attention to his Chicago property, the infamous Murder Castle. When police entered the building, they discovered a labyrinth that seemed less like a hotel and more like the set of a nightmare. Behind ordinary-looking doors were rooms with no windows, false partitions, and hidden passages. Some doors opened onto brick walls, others could only be unlocked from the outside. There were soundproof chambers connected to gas lines, where victims were likely asphyxiated. In the basement, investigators found a dissection table, vats of quicklime, and a massive furnace large enough to cremate bodies. Bones, human and animal, were scattered among piles of ash. The horror of the place shocked even seasoned police officers, and newspapers quickly dubbed it the Castle of Horrors, igniting a media frenzy. As Holmes sat in jail, he watched his carefully constructed world collapse piece by piece. Witnesses began to come forward, former employees, lovers, and neighbors, each telling chilling stories about women who checked in but never checked out, about strange smells rising from the chimney late at night, about crates and barrels being delivered and never leaving. The case grew beyond a simple murder investigation into a national spectacle. The public was morbidly fascinated by the idea that such a place had existed in the heart of Chicago during one of the proudest moments in American history. Holmes, ever the narcissist, relished the attention. He gave interviews to reporters, crafting wild and contradictory confessions, sometimes admitting to dozens of murders, other times claiming innocence. His words were chillingly calm, as though he were describing someone else's life. The castle became a symbol, not just of Holmes' evil, but of the dark underbelly of progress. A reminder that beneath the shining facade of the Gilded Age, there lurked a hunger for power, profit, and control that could turn monstrous. The stage was now set for Holmes' trial, where the nation would confront not only his crimes, but the unsettling truth about how long he had been allowed to get away with them. Holmes' trial began in October 1895, and it immediately captured the nation's imagination. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, eager to catch a glimpse of the man now dubbed America's first serial killer. Newspapers printed sensational headlines, describing him as a master of death and a devil in human form. Yet when Holmes appeared in court, he was calm, well-dressed, and unnervingly polite. He often smiled, addressed the judge respectfully, and even charmed some of the reporters. This dissonance between his genteel demeanor and the horrific crimes he was accused of only deepened the public's fascination. The prosecution focused on the murder of Benjamin Pat, presenting a mountain of evidence, forged documents, testimony from insurance investigators, and medical experts who confirmed Pettersell had been murdered rather than accidentally killed. The most heartbreaking testimony came from detectives who had tracked Holmes' movements with Pettersell's children. They discovered that Holmes had murdered 2 of the children and concealed their bodies in a Toronto house, while the 3rd was found dead in a separate location. The brutality of these acts horrified the courtroom and left little doubt about Holmes' guilt. Holmes, acting as his own attorney for parts of the trial, tried to spin the narrative, claiming he had never intended to harm anyone and that he had been the victim of a conspiracy. But his arguments were erratic and self-contradictory, and his confidence could not mask the damning evidence. What struck many observers was Holmes' complete lack of remorse. He spoke about the murders as though they were business transactions, devoid of emotion, as if the lives he had taken were simply part of a financial arrangement gone wrong. The jury deliberated for only a short time before finding him guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death by hanging. Even after his conviction, Holmes continued to fascinate the public. He wrote an autobiography from his prison cell, attempting to paint himself as a misunderstood genius and weaving bizarre confessions in which he alternately admitted to and denied dozens of killings. Some of his writings bordered on the theatrical, describing himself as being possessed by the devil, a claim that only fueled his legend. By the time his execution date was set, Holmes had become less a man and more a symbol, the embodiment of hidden evil lurking behind the mask of respectability in a rapidly modernizing America. As Holmes awaited execution in Moyer-Mensing prison, he remained an enigma to all who encountered him. Guards described him as calm and courteous, spending much of his time writing letters and his sensational autobiography, which was sold to newspapers for profit. In this autobiography, Holmes alternated between claiming innocence and confessing to dozens of murders, sometimes naming victims who were later proven to be alive. It was as if Holmes were deliberately blurring the line between truth and myth, ensuring that his story would live on long after he was gone. When questioned about the murder castle, he offered chillingly casual remarks about its purpose, saying it was merely a profitable business venture and that any sinister interpretation of its design was the product of the public's imagination. His lack of remorse was unsettling. He never begged for mercy, never wept, never displayed guilt. On May 7th, 1896, Holmes was led to the gallows. The execution chamber was packed with journalists eager to report every detail. Even in his final moments, Holmes kept his composure. He requested no last words of repentance. Instead, he simply stated he had never taken a life, a final contradiction that left the audience wondering whether they were watching the death of a liar or a man who had embraced his own legend. When the trapdoor opened, Holmes' neck did not snap, and his body twitched for several minutes before finally going still, a slow, eerie death that some witnesses described as almost poetic justice. But Holmes' story did not end there. Within weeks of his burial, rumors spread that his spirit haunted the murder castle, and locals swore they saw strange lights in the windows at night. Several key figures connected to his trial, including the judge, the priest who heard his last confession, and even the warden, died under mysterious or sudden circumstances, leading some to whisper about a Holmes curse. Years later, the murder castle itself was mysteriously gutted by fire, its walls reduced to smoldering ruins before it could be turned into a tourist attraction. Whether the fire was an accident, arson, or an attempt to erase the last physical trace of Holmes' crimes remains a mystery. By the time the ashes cooled, H. Holmes had become more than a man. He had become a legend, his name synonymous with evil ingenuity and the darkness that can hide behind the most charming of smiles. Holmes' execution did nothing to end the fascination with his life and crimes. In fact, it seemed to make him immortal in the public imagination. Newspapers and dime novels kept his story alive for years, painting him alternately as a criminal mastermind, a mad scientist, and even a Faustian figure who had sold his soul to the devil. For criminologists and early psychologists, Holmes became a case study in human depravity, a man who appeared intelligent, cultured, and outwardly respectable, but who harbored a compulsion to kill and deceive. He was cited in academic studies as an example of moral insanity, a concept that would later evolve into our modern understanding of psychopathy. What made Holmes so terrifying was that he was not a raving lunatic hiding in the shadows. He was a doctor, a businessman, a neighbor, and a suitor. He used the very trust society placed in him as a weapon. This duality, the respectable exterior and the monstrous interior, made him an early template for the serial killer, archetype that would dominate true crime studies a century later. Holmes' crimes also prompted a re-examination of urban anonymity. The Chicago World's Fair had drawn millions into the city, creating a place where people could vanish without leaving a trace, and Holmes exploited that reality with surgical precision. Some historians argue that his story symbolized a growing fear of modern cities themselves, places where technology, ambition, and greed could conspire to hide unimaginable horrors. In popular culture, Holmes' legend only grew. Writers compared him to Jack the Ripper, and some even speculated the two killers were one and the same, though no evidence supports this. The murder castle became the stuff of dark folklore, often exaggerated into a kind of gothic death trap full of sliding chutes, iron maidens, and acid baths, details more in line with penny dreadful fiction than verified police reports. Yet the truth, stripped of myth, was still horrifying enough. Modern researchers have tried to separate fact from fiction, but Holmes remains elusive, partly because he wanted it that way. His contradictory confessions and carefully crafted lies ensured that no one would ever know the exact number of his victims. For some, that is the final horror, that Holmes took the full measure of his crimes to the grave, leaving history with questions it will never be able to answer. The case of H. Holmes closes not with certainty, but with an uneasy reflection on what he represented. Holmes was not merely a killer of individuals, he was a killer of illusions. His story shattered the comforting belief that evil could be easily recognized, that it wore a grotesque face or lurked only in dark alleys. Instead, Holmes showed that evil could be articulate, well-dressed, and smiling. He operated in plain sight, in the heart of a modern city, and he thrived because society was not prepared to believe that such a man could exist. His crimes force us to confront unsettling questions. How many people ignored their suspicions because they trusted the image of a respectable doctor? How many victims might have been saved if someone had dared to look closer at the disappearances around him? Holmes Castle, whether embellished by legend or not, has become a metaphor for the hidden compartments of human nature. Behind the doors we present to the world, there may be locked rooms, secret passages, and dark spaces where impulses dwell that we dare not acknowledge. This is why Holmes' story continues to resonate more than a century later. He represents not just one man's depravity, but the shadow side of progress itself. The Gilded Age promised advancement, wealth, and the triumph of reason. Yet within its shining cities, men like Holmes could exploit that very optimism to prey upon the vulnerable. True crime enthusiasts still revisit Holmes' case because it feels timeless. The charm, the manipulation, the cold calculation of a man who saw human life as something to be profited from. Modern serial killers are often measured against him, and he remains a benchmark for what we now recognize as psychopathy. Television series, books, and documentaries continue to explore the story, not merely for its shock value, but because it forces us to grapple with a darker truth. Monsters do not always come from the outside. Sometimes they are created by the very systems we trust, capitalism, medicine, technology, and they exploit those systems with terrifying efficiency. In the end, Holmes remains both a warning and a mirror. His crimes tell us less about his monstrousness and more about the world that allowed him to flourish. And perhaps that is the most haunting legacy of all, that if history were to repeat itself, another Holmes could emerge, perfectly hidden behind the mask of normalcy. On the night of June 9th, 1912, the quiet town of Villisca, Iowa, became the stage for one of the most gruesome and perplexing crimes in American history. The Moore family, Josiah, his wife, Sarah, and their 4 children had spent the day attending a church service and social event. That night, 2 young friends of the children, Lena and Ina Stillinger, stayed over for what should have been an ordinary sleepover. By dawn, the house stood silent, curtains drawn, doors locked from the inside. It wasn't until a worried neighbor noticed the lack of activity the next morning and summoned relatives that the horrifying discovery was made. Inside the small white house, every person, all 8 of them, lay dead, their skulls crushed by repeated blows from an axe. The scene was almost too nightmarish to comprehend. Investigators found that the killer had likely been inside the house before midnight, waiting for the family to fall asleep. Each victim had been struck with such force that the axe blade gouged deep into the walls and ceiling. The murderer moved methodically from room to room, sparing no one, even the youngest children. What struck investigators as even more chilling was the ritualistic nature of the scene. Mirrors were covered, windows were draped, and each victim's face had been carefully concealed with clothing or bedclothes, as though the killer could not bear their gaze. In the kitchen, a plate of uneaten food sat on the table, and a bowl of bloody water suggested the killer had taken the time to wash up before leaving. There were no signs of robbery, no valuables missing, nothing to suggest a motive that made sense to the townspeople. News of the murders spread rapidly, and soon Villisca was swarming with law enforcement, journalists, and curious onlookers. The town's sense of safety was shattered overnight. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some believed it was the work of a vagrant. Others whispered that the killer must have been someone the family knew. The brutality of the crime, the lack of clear suspects, and the eerie calm of the murder scene created an atmosphere of fear that would grip Villisca for years to come. This was not just a tragedy, it was a mystery that seemed to mock the very idea of justice. The investigation into the Villisca murders began almost immediately, but it quickly descended into chaos. By the time law enforcement arrived, dozens of townspeople had already trampled through the Moore home, contaminating the crime scene. Some curious onlookers even took souvenirs, fragments of Josiah Moore's skull, bloody pieces of clothing, as though the house was some grim carnival exhibit. This early mishandling of evidence would haunt the case for years, making it nearly impossible to determine with certainty who had committed the atrocity. Sheriff's officers and private detectives began interviewing anyone who had been near the Moore home that night. Suspicion initially fell on a transient stranger reportedly seen near the train depot. Others whispered that Frank Jones, a wealthy local businessman and political rival of Josiah Moore, might have orchestrated the murders. Josiah had once worked for Jones before opening his own farm equipment business, taking several key accounts with him, and rumor had it, carrying on an affair with Jones' daughter. The theory of a hired killer gained traction among locals who could not believe such a crime could be random. Yet investigators also considered another theory, that the murders might be part of a series of similar axe killings spreading across the Midwest at the time. In several small towns from Kansas to Illinois, entire families had been slaughtered in their sleep by an unidentified axe-wielding killer who covered windows and faces, ate food at the scene, and vanished without a trace. Could Villisca have been the latest stop in a serial killer's path of destruction? The possibility terrified the community. The town was gripped by paranoia. Neighbors locked their doors at night for the first time, armed themselves, and kept lanterns burning until dawn. Anyone seen loitering near the streets after dark was confronted. Detectives, meanwhile, struggled to separate credible leads from the noise of rumor and fear. Each passing day seemed to generate new suspects, new accusations, and new dead ends. The Moore's funeral drew thousands, the largest gathering Villisca had ever seen. Yet even as the town mourned, a darker feeling took root, the dread that the murderer was still among them, watching, waiting, perhaps even attending the funeral with everyone else. As investigators worked through the mounting leads, one suspect began to stand out, Reverend George Kelly, a traveling minister who had been in Villisca the night of the murders. Kelly was an eccentric figure, known for his strange behavior and unsettling demeanor. He had preached at the very church service the Moore family attended on June 9th, and was reportedly seen boarding a train early the next morning, just hours after the killings. Witnesses claimed Kelly spoke of the murders before news of them had spread, suggesting he had knowledge of the crime no outsider should have had. Investigators learned that Kelly had a history of mental illness and disturbing behavior. He was once accused of writing obscene letters to women, and was rumored to have a morbid fascination with violence. When questioned, Kelly initially denied involvement, but his story shifted under pressure. At one point, he allegedly confessed to the murders, claiming he heard voices telling him to kill, only to later retract the confession and insist he had been coerced. The case against him was circumstantial, but in a town desperate for justice, many were eager to see him tried. Meanwhile, another line of investigation pointed toward a man named Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the victims, a convicted axe murderer who had killed his mother and grandmother in a nearby town months after the Villisca crime. Some detectives theorized that Henry could have been responsible for multiple axe murders across the Midwest, linking Villisca to a string of similar slayings in Colorado, Kansas, and Illinois. This theory suggested that Villisca might have been targeted at random by a roaming killer, which only deepened the town's unease. Yet not everyone believed the murderer was an outsider. Some locals clung to the theory that Frank Jones or someone connected to him had hired a hitman to eliminate Josiah Moore for business or personal revenge. These competing theories divided the community and kept the case alive in the newspapers for years. But as time passed, and no definitive evidence emerged, the investigation began to lose momentum. Witness memories grew foggy, leads went cold, and the horrific crime that had once shocked the nation started to fade into unsolved legend. Villisca was left not only with 8 dead, but with a gnawing, unanswered question. Was the killer a madman passing through, or someone they had known all along? The arrest and trial of Reverend George Kelly became the focal point of the Villisca case, transforming the small Iowa town into a media circus. Kelly was indicted in 1917, 5 years after the murders, and the courtroom was packed with spectators eager to see the man they believed had terrorized their town brought to justice. Prosecutors argued that Kelly's confession, though later recanted, contained details about the crime that only the killer could have known. They painted him as a disturbed man driven by violent impulses and religious fanaticism, a drifter whose erratic behavior made him the perfect suspect. The defense, however, countered that Kelly's confession had been coerced after hours of relentless questioning, and that he was a mentally fragile man who could be easily manipulated into saying what investigators wanted to hear. They highlighted the lack of physical evidence tying him to the crime. No fingerprints, no bloodstains, no witnesses who had seen him enter or leave the Moore home. The trial became a battle not only over Kelly's guilt, but over the integrity of the investigation itself. Reporters described Kelly's demeanor as strangely calm, even cheerful, during the proceedings, which only deepened public suspicion. He sometimes smiled while hearing the gruesome details of the murders, and at other times he appeared lost in thought, as if detached from the events unfolding around him. This behavior was interpreted by some as proof of guilt, and by others as evidence of a man too mentally unstable to fully comprehend what was happening. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned deadlocked, unable to reach a verdict. Kelly was retried later that year, but this time the jury acquitted him, citing reasonable doubt. For many in Villisca, the outcome was devastating. Some were convinced the murderer had just been set free, while others saw Kelly as a scapegoat, a convenient suspect chosen to satisfy public outrage rather than uncover the truth. With Kelly's acquittal, the official investigation into the Villisca Axe Murders effectively came to a close. No one else was ever charged, and the case was left to languish in the archives, unsolved. But the shadow it cast over Villisca never fully lifted. People locked their doors earlier, watched their neighbors more carefully, and carried a quiet dread that whoever had slaughtered the Moore family might still be out there, perhaps even living among them. As investigators looked beyond Villisca, a chilling pattern began to emerge. The Moore family massacre was not an isolated tragedy. Similar axe murders had been occurring across the Midwest in the years leading up to 1912. Entire families were found bludgeoned to death in their homes, often with an axe taken from the victim's own property. The parallels were unnerving. The killers would cover mirrors and windows, leave food uneaten on tables, and sometimes wash at the victim's basins before disappearing into the night. In some cases, a piece of cloth would be draped over the victim's face, a detail that was eerily present at the Moore house as well. These cases stretched from Kansas to Illinois to Colorado, forming what some modern researchers call the Midwest axe murder belt. One particularly haunting case occurred in Ellsworth, Kansas, where a family of 4 was murdered in 1911 in almost identical fashion to the Villisca crime. Another case in Paola, Kansas, just a month before Villisca, saw a family butchered in their beds, with the house ransacked and the telephone lines cut, a detail also seen in Villisca. Some investigators began to suspect a single traveling killer, perhaps someone who moved along the railroad lines, striking small, rural towns with no warning and vanishing before police could assemble a search. This theory became more compelling when rail schedules were compared to the nights of the murders in many instances. Trains stopped within walking distance of the crime scenes hours before the killings were discovered. Newspapers began running headlines about a possible Midwest axeman, and fear rippled through the farming communities of Iowa and beyond. Families began sleeping with weapons at their bedside, and hardware stores reported increased sales of locks and watchdogs. Law enforcement officials, though reluctant to publicly admit it, quietly shared information between counties, looking for connections. Some criminologists have argued that Villisca was not just a tragedy but part of one of America's first recognized serial killing sprees. If true, it meant the person responsible for the Moore's deaths was likely responsible for dozens of murders across multiple states, a phantom killer who may have claimed victims for years before and after Villisca. The notion that such a predator could move so freely and remain uncaught terrified the public and eroded confidence in the ability of early 20th century policing to protect rural communities from organized repeat offenders. The theory of a traveling serial killer gained further traction with the emergence of a prime suspect, a German immigrant named Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the Villisca victims. In December 1912, just months after the Villisca murders, Moore was arrested for the brutal axe murders of his mother and grandmother in Columbia, Missouri. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Investigators soon realized that Moore had traveled extensively by rail before his arrest, often working odd jobs near tracks and in small farming towns, the same kind of towns where the axe murders had taken place. Detectives in multiple states began re-examining unsolved axe murders, suspecting that Moore might have been responsible for as many as 22 killings between 1911 and 1912. His pattern seemed to fit. He preferred nighttime attacks, used the victim's own axe or blunt instrument, and bludgeoned the victims rather than stabbing or shooting them. Like the Villisca killer, he often posed the bodies or covered their faces after death. Newspapers seized on the story, splashing headlines across the Midwest that proclaimed the axeman of the railroads had finally been caught. But there was one problem. No direct evidence tied Moore to Villisca or most of the other crimes. Investigators were left with circumstantial connections, travel patterns, similarities in weapon choice, and the sheer brutality of his crimes. Some criminologists argue that Moore's conviction offered authorities a convenient way to close the book on a terrifying series of murders, even if they couldn't prove he was guilty of them all. Others maintain that Moore was indeed the killer, a man whose psychological break led him to roam the Midwest and destroy entire families before finally returning home to kill his own blood. Adding to the mystery, some researchers point to other suspects entirely, including itinerant workers, deranged preachers, or even an unidentified serial killer who disappeared as suddenly as he appeared. The lack of fingerprints, the absence of eyewitnesses, and the killer's uncanny ability to avoid detection leave open the possibility that the true Villisca murderer was never caught at all. This unresolved suspect list has kept the case alive for over a century, drawing both professional and amateur sleuths to Villisca to investigate and theorize about who really swung the axe that night. As years passed without a definitive answer, the Villisca Axe Murders transformed from a horrifying crime into a cultural legend, embedding themselves deep into America's fascination with the macabre. By the 1920s, the Moore house had become a place of hushed conversation and fearful curiosity. Locals avoided walking past it at night, whispering about strange noises, flickering lights, and ghostly figures seen in the windows. The house sat largely unchanged for decades, preserved as an eerie monument to the unsolved crime. Journalists revisited the story periodically, each time reigniting public interest and dredging up old fears. Books and crime magazines began labeling Villisca as one of the nation's most haunting murder mysteries, comparing it to the Lizzie Borden case and the Jack the Ripper killings in terms of notoriety. What set Villisca apart was the sheer number of victims and the sense that the killer had vanished into the night, never to be punished. This open-endedness allowed the story to evolve into folklore. People speculated about curses, satanic rituals, and supernatural involvement. By the late 20th century, the Moore house became a magnet for paranormal investigators, ghost hunters, and thrill-seekers. Television shows like Ghost Adventures and Most Terrifying Places in America filmed entire episodes inside the house, claiming to capture disembodied voices, footsteps, and even shadowy apparitions. Psychics reported feeling overwhelming sadness and anger in the bedrooms where the children were killed, while skeptics dismissed the phenomena as the product of overactive imaginations in a charged environment. Still, the house's reputation as one of the most haunted places in America only grew. Tourists traveled from across the country to stay overnight in the house, an experience many described as unsettling, with reports of doors opening by themselves, mysterious banging sounds, and even feelings of being watched or touched. The dark tourism industry around Villisca now plays a significant role in keeping the story alive, turning tragedy into a grim form of education and entertainment. The crime's unresolved nature invites endless speculation and reinvestigation, ensuring that the Villisca Axe Murders will never truly fade from public memory. The case sits at the crossroads of true crime and ghost lore, making it one of the rare historical events that continues to terrify and fascinate more than a century after the blood was washed away. Among all the suspects ever linked to the Villisca case, none has fascinated historians more than Reverend Lynn George Kelly, a traveling preacher whose life seemed as strange as the crime itself. Kelly was a small, wiry man with a nervous demeanor and a reputation for odd behavior. He was in Villisca the night of the murders, attending the same Children's Day program at the Presbyterian church where the Moore family had spent their final hours. Witnesses recalled that he left town early the next morning on a train, just hours before the bodies were discovered. What made Kelly a prime suspect wasn't just his proximity, it was his disturbing personality. He had been accused in the past of voyeurism, of writing obscene letters to women, and of exhibiting signs of mental instability. In 1917, 5 years after the murders, Kelly allegedly confessed during an interrogation to killing the Moors, claiming he heard the voice of God commanding him to slay utterly. However, his confession was quickly retracted, and critics argued that it had been coerced after hours of intense questioning. Kelly's trial became a spectacle. Prosecutors painted him as a deranged killer who struck while under religious mania, but the defense countered with evidence of his fragile mental state and lack of physical capability to commit such a brutal crime. Ultimately, Kelly was acquitted, leaving the case as murky as ever. Yet, suspicion never fully lifted from his name. Many modern researchers argue that Kelly's confession contained details only the killer would know, while others suggest those details could have been fed to him by overzealous investigators desperate for a solution to a case that had haunted Iowa for years. Reverend Kelly remains the most famous suspect tied to Villisca, embodying the archetype of the unlikely murderer, a man of the cloth whose piety might have hidden something far darker. His story continues to divide true crime enthusiasts. Was he a misunderstood eccentric who became a convenient scapegoat? Or was he the very monster who crept into the Moore house that night with holy voices ringing in his ears? The ambiguity surrounding Kelly fuels endless debate and adds yet another layer of psychological intrigue to a case already saturated with horror and speculation. While Reverend Kelly's strange behavior made him the most sensational suspect, he was far from the only one. Investigators explored several other leads, each pointing toward a different possible motive for the massacre. One theory focused on Frank Jones, a wealthy Villisca businessman and former Iowa state senator who had once employed Josiah Moore. Josiah had left Jones's implement store years earlier to start his own business, allegedly taking customers with him and sparking a bitter rivalry. Rumors circulated that Jones harbored a personal grudge against Moore, not just for the business slight, but for whispers that Josiah may have had an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law. Some theorists believe Jones hired a hitman to kill Moore and his family, a claim Jones vehemently denied. Investigators even followed up on leads involving William Blackie Mansfield, a man accused of several axe murders in other states. Mansfield had been convicted of killing his wife, child, and in-laws with an axe in Illinois 2 years after Villisca, and his crimes bore striking similarities to the Moore family murders. Detectives believed Mansfield might have been a contract killer who traveled by rail committing family annihilations for hire. However, Mansfield was eventually released due to lack of evidence tying him to Villisca. Another line of inquiry targeted transient workers, hobos and drifters who frequently rode the trains passing through town. Some criminologists suggest the killer could have been a completely unknown figure who struck at random, vanishing on the early morning train before anyone suspected foul play. This theory is supported by the fact that many similar axe murders occurred along railroad lines, suggesting a nomadic predator rather than someone with a personal motive. Each of these theories brought with it tantalizing clues but no definitive proof. As years passed, the official investigation stalled, and no one was ever convicted. The result was a case that felt both intensely personal and terrifyingly impersonal. It could have been a hired killer enacting revenge, or it could have been a stranger who simply chose the Moore house by chance. This duality, personal vendetta versus random horror, keeps the case so compelling. The notion that a respected local leader might have orchestrated the crime casts a shadow over Villisca's history, while the possibility of a wandering serial killer speaks to a darker, more universal fear that evil can strike without warning, leaving no trace except the carnage it leaves behind. As the years stretched on, the official investigation into the Villisca murders slowly unraveled, losing momentum with every passing lead that turned cold. Witness memories faded, evidence degraded, and the once intense press coverage shifted to other stories, leaving the town with a wound that never fully healed. Villisca tried to move forward, but the murders cast a long shadow over its identity. For decades, the Moore House sat as a quiet reminder of that terrible night, its walls absorbing the whispers of a community that never got closure. Children grew up hearing the story as a kind of grim, cautionary tale, a reminder to lock their doors and stay inside after dark. Some locals refused to even discuss the murders, believing that speaking of them would invite darkness back into their lives. Others kept the story alive through oral tradition, fueling speculation and conspiracy theories that grew more elaborate with time. The town's reputation suffered, with some outsiders avoiding Villisca entirely, associating it with death and bad luck. Businesses struggled, and residents complained that the name Villisca had become synonymous with murder. Over the decades, the case files were revisited periodically by sheriffs, amateur detectives, and journalists hoping to solve the mystery once and for all. Each time, hopes were raised and then dashed when no breakthrough came. By the mid-20th century, the Villisca case was more ghost story than active police investigation, a legend that loomed over the small Iowa community like a specter. But with the rise of true crime as a popular genre in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Villisca found an unlikely form of revival. Rather than trying to hide its past, the town embraced its dark history, turning the Moore House into a historical site and offering tours to curious visitors. What was once a symbol of terror became a pilgrimage site for true crime enthusiasts and paranormal investigators. This shift allowed Villisca to reclaim its narrative, though the air of tragedy never fully dissipated. The house remained a place where visitors reported an eerie stillness, where the past felt unnervingly close, as though the night of the murders was somehow frozen in time. In a strange way, the unsolved nature of the crime became Villisca's most enduring legacy, ensuring that the Moore family and the 8 lives lost would never be forgotten, even if justice was never served. More than a century later, the Villisca Axe Murders remain one of America's most enduring true crime mysteries, a story that refuses to die because it was never given an ending. Its power lies in its unresolved nature. We do not know who killed the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters. We do not know why, and we do not know whether the killer ever faced justice or simply melted back into the world. This lack of resolution has turned Villisca into a case study in the psychology of fear and obsession. Historians, criminologists, and amateur sleuths continue to dig through the evidence, writing books, producing documentaries, and debating theories. Each generation rediscovers the case and reinterprets it through the lens of its own anxieties, some focusing on the failings of early police work, others on the idea of a roaming serial killer who predated modern criminal profiling. The Moore House itself stands as the centerpiece of this fascination. Unlike many historic crime scenes, it has been meticulously preserved to appear exactly as it did in 1912, right down to the period furnishings. This preservation transforms the house into a kind of time capsule, a place where visitors can confront the past directly, walking the same floors where the victims once slept. For some, this is an act of remembrance, For others, it is a brush with darkness, a test of courage. Paranormal investigators report unexplained activity, giving the house a second life as one of the most haunted locations in America, ensuring that the story continues to attract attention from believers and skeptics alike. But beneath the ghost lore and tourism lies the real tragedy. 8 lives violently stolen, a community forever scarred, and a family line cut short. The Villisca Axe Murders remind us of the vulnerability of small-town America, of the thin line between normalcy and catastrophe. It is a story about trust shattered, about the terror of an unknown evil that could step out of the night and erase an entire household. Its legacy is one of perpetual unease, a reminder that not every crime is solved, not every question has an answer, and sometimes the most terrifying killer of all is the one who vanishes into history, leaving only silence where justice should have been.